Hey everybody, this is Dan Collins of the CUNY-Kingsborough Math and Computing Department, and in this video I'm going to show you how to deploy a test that you have in Blackboard, which is to say actually schedule it, assign it, get it visible to the students. So in my prior videos we actually made a couple tests, one in Blackboard itself, one using Pearson TestGen and then importing it. So at this point, maybe you have a couple tests in your test database in Blackboard, and at that point, it's entirely invisible and inaccessible to the students. But now you'd actually like to assign it and get in front of the students, which is what Blackboard calls deploying it. I've left for a separate video. I'm going to talk about how the students interact with it and how you're going to grade it afterwards. I kind of wanted this, even though we're going to be spending most of our time on one single screen in Blackboard, I kind of wanted to break this out as its own discussion because honestly, this is possibly the most sensitive issue, I guess. This is where we're going to decide what our exam control protocols are and how generous or strict we want to be about those. And I have, as someone who's used Blackboard quite a bit, I've never given a high stakes exam on Blackboard. So I don't have a very strong opinion about this. I don't have very much data to make recommendations with. So this video is going to be a little bit more discussive about what the options are in front of us, because we're all going to have to make our own decisions or have continuing conversations with our colleagues about what we're going to do about this. So there you go. So the options for how we deploy a Blackboard test. So as usual, I'll hit you with a little bit of philosophy to begin with. I'll say that the Blackboard defaults are generally about as generous as you could possibly imagine. Blackboard defaults usually to exactly the opposite of what our standard in-class practice would be. So we'll look at all the options and I'll talk about, why is it sitting, why does it default the way that it currently is, versus what could we do if we wanted to simulate the in-class experience as much as possible. Now, warning, I guess, I think I'm right about this, is the more strict that we set these options, the more problems we're probably going to have to field from students after the fact. Students are going to have connection issues. They're going to have lost connections with either a phone or a laptop computer on Wi-Fi. That totally happens with everything I ever give. Students are going to have technology issues. They're going to, if this is the first time they're doing it, they are going to, possibly get lost in the computer navigation for some of them. You will, the more strict you make that, and the sooner students get cut off, the more grievances that you're going to have to field and consider after the fact. It is possible after the fact, like if a student does have a bungled grade, to clear that out and possibly have them retake it or something like that. Not super easy, honestly. So I think for many of us, the more we could tamp down on those kind of grievances, the more time we would save and the more time we would have to spend on the class as a whole, making that better, actually. I usually, even though I've done this for a while, I know that I'm going to have to field some of these concerns or issues after the fact, and I do wind up maybe in the first week or so as I get started with my classes that use this. I'm going to have to take some student comments. I might have to clear out a grade if it was accidentally submitted with no questions filled in. That totally happens sometime. Obviously, that couldn't possibly be anybody's intention. So I do actually take a comment from a student, clear that out, and usually let them try again for something like that. And the other thing here in the current context that we're in is of this sudden and surprise for all of us switch to fully online learning, is I think we have to ask ourselves honestly, were students prepared for online testing? Is this something that they consented to and knew about in advance? Well, actually, no. We didn't have time in class to prepare them for this. We didn't have time to show them what the navigation is going to look like. I don't know if their equipment's going to be right. They're going to be taking a high stakes test, I guess, for some of us, the very first time, learning how to navigate the test. And I'm sure there's going to be problems with that we probably ought to be sensitive about being, maybe a little bit more generous than we normally are. Look, a little, personal, reveal here. One of our prior advisors in our department told me that the number one criticism that she would get from students about me personally was that I was way too strict about my policies and my testing procedures. So I'm kind of sort of famous for that, I guess, in the department. But that having been said, in this particular case, even I am probably expecting to be a little bit more generous and give a little bit more leeway to students probably than I would have otherwise. And again, it's going to be a time-saving issue if you can reduce the number of fatal errors and grievances that you have to deal with students after the fact. I'm going to look at, so a couple of us 2 years ago took a seminar in how to teach online, or at least how to teach hybrid courses, which are partly online, about 2 years ago through the CUNY SPS, oh brother, what is that again? Center for Professional Services or something like that. That's not it, but anyway, you can look it up afterwards. CUNY SPS. And the book that they used for that training is a book by Susan Coe and Steve Rawson named Teaching Online: A Practical Guide. So here is a book. It's gone through many editions, entirely dedicated just to how to teach online. And I'm just going to kind of underscore the fact that all of us are learning how to do this for the first time. Probably you, me included right now. Let me just turn to that book. Here is the Teaching Online: A Practical Guide book. It is available on Amazon if you want to look at that. I thought it was a pretty good book to get started with to begin with. And I'll just kind of flip through here because near the end, they have an example syllabus from the authors about what they think the best practice would be for a fully online course. And in this part, I'll just scroll up here. So basically, common syllabus type stuff. So here they have the grading information section of their canonical online course syllabus, grading information here. And you can see they have participation, they have a short essay paper, final analytic paper, and they have, for their exam, they have a proctored exam. They have an in-person proctored exam that even for this allegedly online course, the best thing that they can come up with is an exam that you do actually have to schedule, go in person, show an ID someplace, and take their exam in person. So even this book on online teaching doesn't have any solution to the exam issue other than have an in-person proctored exam. So we're all kind of at sea about this at the moment. There's also, I'll flip back to my slideshow here. There's also a lot of commentary at the moment in the forum known as Stack Exchange, which was originally for computing-based questions. But nowadays they have a forum for general academia. They have a forum for mathematics educators. They have a forum for computer science educators. And just as I shoot this video in March of 2020, there's several questions there about how are we going to teach online and how are we going to give exams or things that count like exams online. And there's a whole bunch of different opinions, and there's clearly no strong consensus. And we're all of us all around the world basically are going to have to learn how to do this and discover what the best practices are kind of shortly. All right. So there's my philosophy, and again, we're kind of thinking about the continuum between what's our standard classroom practice, where we want to be, have a very high level of integrity to our results, versus what's happening online and what are the defaults in Blackboard in particular that are very, very generous. Maybe those are communicating to us what the standard online practice is. I'm really not entirely sure, but there's a pretty wide continuum that we're going to be looking at here. All right, so let me switch over to Blackboard. And remember that in the prior videos, we do actually have 2 tests in our testing database. And if you wanted to see those, I would go down to Course Tools and then Test Surveys and Pools and click on Tests. And you would see the 2 tests that we have in the database at this point. So now I'm going to go and actually deploy at least one of those tests or assign it to students. And over here on the menu, I might consider just dropping it, making these, and again, the menu, the top menu here is what the students can actually see. They cannot see stuff under course management, where we currently have the tests. They have no way of accessing that right at the moment. So we got to have some kind of place here on the main menu where the tests are going to appear. Could be any one of these content areas. You could put it in content if you wanted to. Admittedly, I actually do make a dedicated space for my tests and assignments. So I'm going to do that right now just to be perfectly clear about it. If you want to add an item, a button to this menu here, you're going to hover over this plus sign, right? You're basically going to make some kind of content area, so I'll click on that. I will call this content area my testing area. Sometimes I call that assignments, and I glom on all my assignments and my tests in one place. Definitely want to make it available to users. Click that, hit submit. So I have this new testing area that just showed up here. Perhaps I don't like where it's located. I could grab it on the left-hand side and move it up just under content, because it's kind of like a content area. The little white box there says that the area is currently empty, right? Since we put some stuff in the content area before, that doesn't have the white box anymore. So I'll click on my brand new, currently empty testing area. And so obviously nothing here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start deploying my tests in this area. That counts as an assessment, which is the second button. So I'll hover over assessments. And now for the first time, I'm actually going to make a test visible to students. So I'll click on test. And you can see here that I could do one of two things here. I could either say, hey, I'm going to create a brand new test, hit that, and then we would fall back into the test creation facility that we used in a prior video, or we can just add an existing test from the database here. And that's usually kind of the easiest way to do it. I kind of want to distinguish between the test creation, which is a pretty involved process, and the test deployment. So I usually go create it as one step and then just pick from the existing test table at this point. So maybe I'm going to assign the statistics test, which has just 3 multiple choice questions on it that we did in the last video. So pick that. I'll hit submit. And here's the page that we're going to spend some time discussing and reflecting. So here's the test options page. Obviously, you need to give your test a name, and by default, that is just filled in with whatever name you gave the test when you created it. If you wanted to change it, you could. If you wanted to have some more description show up in the deployment that students would see, you could fill that in here if you wanted to. I usually don't bother to do that. Remember when we made the test, we should have filled in a description and instructions, and that's just going to be carried along. When the students start the test, they will see that automatically. So hopefully if you did that, there's no need for you to put any description here at all. So skip that. All right, so here come some of the options. Do you want the test to open up in a new browser window? Now, our colleague Ganesh in the department, who for several years was the school's Blackboard administrator, he recommends that you set that to yes. And his justification is that then the students will get the test in a dedicated window and they can full screen it and they can use the entire screen real estate to look at the test. Personally, I actually recommend that you select no. I'm worried about students that are not computer proficient, that if they have one window floating over another window, and I've actually seen this in like an M2 exam once, I think, that they're going to accidentally click on the first window, and then since that's already full screened, it's going to cover up their actually testing window, and they're not going to know how to get back to that. So personally, under the less is more principle, I think I would prefer to have a cleaner system with fewer windows rather than more for students to possibly get lost in. I could be crazy, could be totally wrong about that. You notice that the Blackboard system defaults to no, so I'm just not gonna change that myself. But there are different opinions about that, and I could be totally wrong about that. I suppose if we were really wise, what we would do is we would survey the students about which one they preferred. But I guess we haven't thought to do that to date. So you'll have to think about that. All right, so here comes the test availability section where we're deciding on policies about how generous or strict to allow the students to, what times and things like that they can interact with the test. Do you want to make the test available to students? I see no reason to make that no, unless you're like temporarily going through the deploy process but don't actually want students to see it yet. I've never left that at no, so I'll click that. I'll set that to yes. Do you want to add do you want a new announcement for this test? So if you wanted it to, Blackboard would automatically put an announcement in your announcements section, and then that in turn, I think, would fire off an email to students so that they know about that. The default is no. I always leave that at no. I believe that there are some instructors that set that to yes, because I do have students sometimes in my classes ask, are you going to send out an email every time a test shows up? And I personally tell them, no, I will not. I've given you a schedule. I've told you in advance when the test is going to be. It's your responsibility to remember that date and time. And you can trust me that when I said the test was going to be happening, that's when it's going to be happening. So I would recommend that you be consistent to your students. Tell them about it in advance. It shouldn't be a surprise that they need an announcement for. And for my money, I'd rather keep my announcements area cleaner rather than have more stuff cluttering it up. So I leave that at the default no. I know there are instructors at Kingsborough that set that to yes. Multiple attempts. Do you want the student to be able to take the test once and then try it all over again a second time and try it all over again a third time? So this is probably the one place where the Blackboard default and our in-class practice align. As you can see, that checkbox is not checked. And obviously, very, very few of us in our discipline or our department would give a test and then just at a student's whim, just allow them to take it all over again for no particular reason. So I always leave that unchecked. I do not allow multiple attempts normally in the past. I'm sure that's not really how in-class tests work. I know there are some instructors that check this off, and they're being a little bit generous. Maybe if you're thinking about what you're doing as a practice test, I guess, that would be a good simulation of letting students take it more than once. You might also think if a student is going to have trouble or if they're going to get mentally confused about this new online thing, maybe allow them to take it twice, and maybe that'll reduce some problems or some grievances that you get after the fact. As you can see here, if you check that off, you could allow unlimited attempts, or you could fill in a certain number of attempts that you want to permit, like 2 or 3 maybe. I'm pretty sure that one of our colleagues is planning on doing that, maybe giving 2 attempts this spring 2020 semester to give a little bit of a buffer for student problems. So consider that completely legitimate, completely legitimate. Now, if you give multiple attempts, then you can pick whether you want the actual official grade to be based on the highest or the lowest or the earliest or the last. You can see that defaults to the last. That makes sense. If you left this checkbox for multiple attempts empty, this isn't even an option that you have to choose from. So I'm certainly not going to interact with that. Force completion. Okay, so the question here is, once a student starts the test, can they shut off the browser and then come back later, reopen the browser, and continue interacting with the test? So on the one hand, if you're being, so obviously that would not be like our in-class practice. You don't let a student get up and just wander out of the classroom for no reason and come back whenever they want. And so you might think that this is something you would want to click on. I think that some of us recently read an article on exam control procedures in the Journal of Academic and Business Ethics, I believe. And to make a long story short, that article was basically just saying be as strict as you conceivably can be about every single option here in the Blackboard test availability section. Now, again, the context that I think they're thinking about is a context where students actually consented, knew they were signing up for online classes, right, and were willing to queue up for that kind of ultra strict behavior that we're not in. So the downside, if you set force completion, I'll just click it momentarily. If you set force completion, the major downside, and I think that I'm pretty sure Ganesh agrees with this, is that if the student has a connection problem, if their connection problem on their phone or laptop or desktop computer momentarily cuts out and they lose their connection to the CUNY Blackboard system and they turn around 2 seconds later, they try to reconnect, they will be locked out of the test. So that's one of the major, so for what it's worth, like I have these first week diagnostic tests, and kind of just for my entry point to communicate that I'm being really super serious and really super strict about that. That actually is the one and only time I do have force completion set on. And I know that some students are going to have connection problems, and they're going to contact me afterwards and say that, and I actually am going to have to field that and give them, clear out their attempt and give them a second try at that. And I'm willing to deal with that the first week, just to kind of set that tone. But I bet that if you're giving a high stakes exam, I bet you're probably going to want to leave that unchecked, so that if students do have a connection mishap, they can just reconnect. What we'll be doing later, further down the page here, is we'll be using things like test availability dates and times and due dates, and that's how we're going to enforce a limited scope of time for students to interact with a test. So probably leave that unchecked. That was the default in Blackboard. Now, there's a timer here that you can set if you like. By default, it's not. By default, in Blackboard, once a student starts a test, regardless of due date, regardless of test availability or anything else, it would let the student take an arbitrary amount of time. So they start the test, and then hypothetically 6 hours later, they've still got the browser up, they're still working on it, and they can submit their test. Super, super different than our in-class practice. So I'm guessing that most of us are going to want to set that timer, right? And then at least there will be a timer, and the student, that time will obviously run out at some point. Make a decision about how many minutes you want to set that at. Most of our in-class stuff is 60 minutes, obviously, so you could model that. I guess would be the strictest possible option. In this new environment where students are handling the computer literacy issue and the navigational issues, which are totally brand new, in addition to the actual test material, you might want to double it. You might want to give them 2 hours. You might want to give them 3 hours. I think that those are all completely legitimate things. I know one of our colleagues who's going to give them, who their plan is to give them double time this semester. Personally, I think that would be a great idea. Now, again, Blackboard being super generous, even if you set the timer, by default, when the timer runs out, the student will be informed the time ran out, and yet they will still be allowed to keep taking the test. By default, Blackboard still doesn't cut them off. So if you want them to actually be cut off and have the test effectively just taken away from them, you've got to click this on button down here under auto submit. Anytime I set the timer, I always set that to on. That is, again, the best model, the in-class practice. If you leave that to the default off, the student can continue interacting with the tests, technically for an arbitrary amount of time, but their grade in the grade center will be flagged with a mark saying they went over time, and then hypothetically an instructor could go in there and either dock them points or something like that. But that's certainly not something I want to deal with for time purposes. Come up with a particular time. Maybe this semester it's 120 minutes. It could be 60. And I would probably recommend that you set auto submit to on, so it actually gets taken away from them at some point. Probably. Okay, now we have the display start and end times. So this indicates when the test is actually visible or accessible at all to be clicked on in the Blackboard testing area that we just made a couple seconds ago. Now further down, there's a different thing called a due date. But what we're looking at right now is the test even visible whatsoever? Probably for a high stakes exam, I'm going to guess that you're going to want to set this. Again, which is not the Blackboard default. The Blackboard default is it just appears forever anytime the student wants, if these boxes are not checked. So probably, thinking about the in-class behavior, the test paper is literally available physically to the paper just for a limited hour-long window. So you probably want to simulate that. And I'll also say that this is actually the strictest thing you can possibly use here. Once this date, if you set display after and display until, once this second date and time is gone, the students can't see, cannot click on, cannot access, don't have any hint that the test even existed, basically. So if you want to be strict about when they can access it, this is really the thing you use to be really precise about that. So when do you want to make that available? You could make it available for the 1 hour of your normal class time, would be reasonable. Remember now, even though it's available for 1 hour, once a student starts, even if it's just in the last 5 minutes, right, the amount of time they have available is based on this set timer above. So a student could come in the last 5 minutes, start, and then they would have the full 2 hours, according to what we currently have set, to actually continue making the test available. And I know that for some of our M1, M2 courses that are, or at least M1 is on Blackboard now, that might be a slightly surprising moment for instructors to interface with, because we're accustomed to a particular cutoff time that's common to everybody. But when students go into the computer lab to do it on Blackboard, they can come in anytime they want in the window, and they will have the entire full 2 hours or 1 hour, whatever, to continue taking the test. So sometimes there's a little bit of a miscommunication between the IT staff running that and the course instructors having different expectations about that. So, so granted that, you could make the test available just for the 1 hour of your class time. The exam control procedures article from the journal I was talking about, again, is the strictest thing possibly imaginable. They say make it only available for the first 15 minutes of your class. Boy, I think it's super possible students are going to miss that and complain and be super confused. So I would be surprised about anyone using that. You could be more generous, and you could make it, again, in this online situation, you could make it available for 2 hours. You could make it available for 3 hours to give students a little bit more flexibility about when they have access to it. You could make it available for a whole day, right? I think that if people were teaching an online class with students all around the globe, with different time zones and things like that, they would make it available for one whole calendar day and allow students to interact anytime they wanted. So I think for us, any one of those things, perfectly legitimate. We could consider one of these tests to be a take-home exam, and then the availability is a whole day here. I think that would be fine. Or you could make it 1 hour, or you could really, be really super strict and set it to like 15 minutes, and please tell the rest of us how that went. Now, there is an option for a password here. I think that the usage that sort of makes sense would be a case where you're going to have students come into a computer lab for physical in-person presence to be, proctored in person. I think this is totally what we do in the M1 arithmetic classes, and then have a password that they can only get by being physically in the room, maybe written on the whiteboard or something like that. So the student is definitely there, and they had to be in the room in order to get this. I don't see any advantage to setting that in our current online situation. For the student to get on Blackboard in the first place, they had to use their credentials and their own individual password just to get here. So I really don't see any advantage to setting another password that then you have to communicate by email or an announcement or something like that. That is just an additional, bump in the road that I don't think anybody needs or wants. So I would recommend probably not using that. All right, test availability exceptions. So never use this if you want to get super fancy. I think that like an institution could set up a special group, maybe of students using services from the accessibility offices, and then you could click on add a particular user or add a particular group and give them extended time, I guess, or possibly modify any of the options up above. I've never used that. I'm just kind of guessing that's what that's for. So feel free to explore that. And if you do have a student that gets extra time, maybe possibly you can handle it like this, I guess. I'm just guessing. If that works out for you, tell us, because I'd like to know myself. Here is a due date. So here's a date that you're expecting the product to be done. Now, I never use both the availability up above date and also the due date. I always pick one or the other. For assignments that I talked about in another video, I actually always use the due date now. I do not use the availability up above. So I don't, for like a paper assignment or like a programming, assignment, I don't see any reason why not to leave that visible all semester long and have students be able to view the assignments that are coming up throughout the semester, know that I personally have a plan in place, that I'm not making the stuff on the fly, and also recall what assignments they have, accomplished in the past. So for paper assignments, I don't use those availability dates. They're just visible all the time, but I do use a particular due date that says you have to submit it at this point for the full credit. If you wanted to use a due date, that's really more for assignments for me. You'd click here. Now again, Blackboard being generous, even though the due date goes by, Blackboard will still let a student submit the assignment or test nonetheless. If you don't want that, you got to click this due date, and you have to click this special button that says do not allow students to start the test. If you don't do that, students can submit it late. It gets a flag in the grade center, and then you can decide whether to deduct points or just send a cranky email or something like that. But anyway, I'm going to guess for a high stakes exam, you're probably going to want to use the availability to be very strict about when it's visible and when it's not, and probably just skip the whole due date. That's what I'm guessing. Self-assessment options. Where do the results of this test show up? By default, we're expecting that the test will produce a grade, and that's going to land in the grade center automatically, and it will get included in whatever you set up for your final weighted total formula. So I always leave that checked. I wouldn't give a test if there wasn't a grade I wasn't interested in using. Again, if you want a practice test, right? You want to make a practice test to induct students into this whole process, I guess leave that unchecked, and then the grade that's being produced will not actually be used in the final weighted total. So I guess that's an option. Hide results for this test completely from the instructor in the grade center. I've never ever used that. I guess that would be interesting for, again, a practice test session where that's totally, completely secret from the instructor. So students could interact with the test, find out how to navigate it, and have no concern that the instructor would see that and be biased against them or something. I guess I'm just thinking all that. Anyway, I never ever interact with these two buttons. I leave them just like they showed up here to begin with. Now, after the test is over, students are definitely going to see their score. Okay, as far as I know, there's nothing that you can do to change the fact that when they get done with like a multiple choice test, at least, they're going to see what their score was immediately. Say, you got an 80 on this test or something like that. Actually, there's been some final exams where that actually caused a problem. So I believe what I was told recently is with our M1 exams, we did communicate with CUNY Central, and we got some kind of special programming dispensation specifically for the M1 finals to remove that. But in any other situation, students with a multiple choice, they're totally going to see their score at the end. In addition to that, how much other information, how much other feedback do you want the system to automatically provide the students after their test is done? So you can see here that by default, what Blackboard wants to permit is that immediately after each student's submission, right after they submit maybe a multiple choice test, they can go in and they can see specifically what their score was on each individual question. So if you had a 10-question multiple choice test, they'd see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and they'd see whether they got 0 points or whether they got 10 points on it, or however you set up the scoring to that, right? That's the default. If you want to add more information to that, you could use these checkboxes here, and they would actually see the specific answer options, which is not the default, right? The default is just the score they got. But if you actually want them to go back and see the question options in that multiple choice test, you could click this. You could mark off the one that was actually correct. You could mark off the one that particular student submitted so they could compare. And that that actually does model, taking a test, grading it, and then handing it back to the student for them to study with afterwards. So that can make a lot of sense, I guess. But maybe you don't want to give that out to one student right after they got done, and maybe you're concerned about them taking that information and shipping it off to another student. Now, this drop down here would allow you to change when that information that you've selected actually shows up. So by default, it's after submission. But for some of the stuff that I do, I guess for my weekly quizzes, I guess that I do in math classes, I set that to after the due date. So due date happens for me like Sunday 9 p.m. No student can take it anymore at that point. All the students have a grade in the can, and then at that second, and again for multiple choice tests, they've all been graded automatically. And then at that second that the due date expires, now students can get back online if they want. They can see the entire quiz, because I've selected all this stuff over here, and they can compare the correct answers to what they submitted, and then hopefully use that to improve their learning. Now, if it wasn't a multiple choice test, if it had open response items that the instructor is going to have to go spend time manually grading, then maybe what you want to pick is after attempts are graded. And then it would be waiting for you, the instructor, to grade all the attempts, and as soon as that happens, automatically the students can get on, see all the questions, see all the responses, and again, use that to model handing the test back when appropriate. Again, without printing out any paper, without you emailing individual students. Blackboard just handles the whole thing. When students log in, they can see their own individual stuff. If you're not using the due date, if you're using the availability date, which I guess I was actually recommending for a high-stakes exam, even though I haven't done that personally yet, I guess maybe you want to use after availability end date. Let me think about that, actually. Okay, so a student can get on 5 minutes before the availability end date and still be taking the test for 2 hours. So maybe you don't want that. Maybe you do want after all the attempts are graded. Just kind of thinking about that. Yeah, so I'm one of those. Anyway, I might come back in like a couple of days and go and change my mind about some of this stuff. But so the ones that I have personally used is I have used after due date, and if it was open response, I would certainly consider after attempts are graded would make sense. Now there's 2 boxes here, so actually if you want to give some information at one time and like more information at another time, you could do that. So I guess you could say right after the submission, allow them to see the score per question, and then maybe later on, after everything's graded, show all this other information, like the specific options, the correct answer, the submitted answer. So you could do that. I don't think I've actually ever done that, honestly. So I'll set this back to choose. Or you can be even more strict than the Blackboard default, and you could take this first box here and click choose, which is to say you're effectively leaving it blank, and now the student won't get the scores per question. They won't get any extra information other than just the overall score in their test, which again, last I checked, is not something that you can prevent. So I think that's the most strict that you can be there. So think about that. Think about those options. I think probably, again, if we were modeling in-class behavior, we'd say after the attempts are graded, show basically everything to the student like that. Again, for multiple choice tests is what I'm thinking about. And then that would clear out your workload, and that getting the information back to students to study with is automatically handled by Blackboard. So maybe that's a pretty good idea. All right, final little section here of the options, test presentation. So you're picking this radio button here, you're picking between option 1 and option 2. Do you want to present all the questions all at once in one single big long window that the students are going to scroll down? Or do you want to present one question at a time on the screen that the students navigate between? Personally, I actually always pick one at a time. Now my thinking here is I'm trying to have less of an information overload for the students. So I think that it's mentally cleaner for them to be focused on just one single thing is what I'm thinking about. Could be crazy about that, but I do set it to one at a time, and then they can navigate between them. Now, that having been said, there is this checkbox here to prohibit backtracking. The strictest thing you could possibly do is click on that, and then once they interact with question 1 and move on to the next one, they cannot go back. The Journal of Academic Business Ethics article recommends clicking that. Again, they want to be as strict as humanly possible. They want to check everything off here to the strictest possible thing. They recommend checking that. I've never seen anybody give a test like that. The system that provides our CEF in the M2 algebra classes does not do that. You can totally backtrack to any question you want. That would not model in-class behavior, right? If a student has a piece of paper, they can totally pick and choose which question they want to attack next. And if they have extra time, they can go back and they can double check. They can edit an answer. They can elaborate on an answer if they want to. So even for our in-class practice, that would not be representative or a good model of that. So me personally, could be crazy. I would recommend not checking that in an attempt to make that like the in-class testing. I think if I were a student and that was the case, I would be a little bit frustrated possibly. And the very final checkbox here, which is maybe one of the most interesting, is randomized questions. If you check this, then the order of the questions on your test is going to be scrambled up differently for every single student. I like that a lot, particularly for a multiple choice test. Why not? Right? That gives a little bit more test integrity. I think it's just a little bit more interesting in some sense. It's actually maybe, statistically, thank you, Firefox. It's statistically a little bit more interesting to have the questions come in any kind of order without being predictable to the students. So it's, I guess, in the educational circles, they sort of call that mixed practice, I guess. And in addition, if a student does try to say, hey, question 1, the answer is B, well, that's a different question for anybody else. And if you set up the questions right in your test, all the options are also being scrambled automatically too. So I don't see any reason why not to do that, basically. Except for one thing. There actually is one very small disadvantage to that, and this is this. If you are doing some fancy statistical analysis after the fact, which I actually do, you can download all the results from all the questions from all the students to a local spreadsheet and then do some kind of analysis. Now the problem is if you've randomized the questions, those don't sync up anymore, right? That download you can get later on is totally scrambled up the same way the students saw it. So question 1 for Alice is not actually the same as question 1 for Bob, and trying to do a statistical analysis on that, it doesn't make any sense to take the average of that stuff or anything because they're actually all different questions. So that actually does provide a very small little road bump in that case. I have personally written a program to take that data and then see what the questions are and sort it back into the correct order. So if hypothetically you wanted to do that kind of statistical analysis and you needed that tool, get in touch with me, email dcollins@Kingsborough, and I can provide you with that tool that takes that data and then sorts it back into order after you've randomized the questions. Anyway, probably a little niche case. I'm probably the only person that needs to do that, but just that's the one small little, everything here has an advantage and a disadvantage. And so there's the little disadvantage after the fact if you do randomize questions. But you know what? I basically always do this on at least my diagnostic tests. So that's probably a pretty neat idea. All right, so there's all those options and a whole lot of different things that we're all going to be thinking about. I've set things like maybe I would do for this. Okay, so here I am back in the testing content area that we created, and you can see that the test that we were deploying is actually visible here. I don't think in that example I actually set the date time to anything useful, but assuming that you did, it should be available to students at the appropriate time. If the availability date hasn't occurred yet, then you're going to see it here as the instructor, but the students would not if they got to this point. Remember that anything here on this menu, again, is accessible to students. They could click on testing, but they won't actually see this test until the availability start date occurs. If you want to be totally sure about that and double check it, remember up here on the top right, you could enter student preview and you can confirm exactly what a student would see right this very second. So at least while the availability window is occurring, students can see it here and they can click on that name and they can get started, but I will leave that for another video actually. Okay, so let me flip back to so there's the deployment process, but let me flip back to my slideshow here and just kind of talk about, here's the things that I know about have worked for me. So here are two things that I really have used in my classes over the years, just to kind of give you a scope of this rather large menu of options that we have in front of us. So in all of my classes for at least 5 or 6 years, I give a diagnostic test in the very first week on information that students should know from whatever the prerequisite class is. And this is for a grade. It counts the same as a weekly quiz or a weekly programming assignment or something like that. So not a heck of a lot of points, but I kind of do want to know what students actually know coming in and whether there's anything that is, unexpected in either direction. And it's also an opportunity for me to possibly give advice about like a couple times I've discovered students that actually just missed the prerequisite, never took the prerequisite class, and there was some kind of glitch in registration and they were literally in the wrong class. So I've caught that at least a couple times, or advising students about their current program or something like that. So I want them to take it seriously. I want them to do as well as they possibly can to get proper information. And that's why I actually do set a grade on it. So this is actually probably the closest thing I've done to date for an actual real test in the class. For those diagnostic tests, and maybe I'm getting cute about this, but I leave the availability always, because as soon as the student first logs into Blackboard, the test is actually available for them to take anytime they want. I actually used to put this up before the semester started by a week or two, but there aren't many students that are that proactive. And I was doing work before the semester started, and I've gotten away. I've stopped doing that recently. But the test, those diagnostic tests are always available as soon as the student logs in. Even after they take it, it's going to be visible there to remind them that that was one of the things that they did. Now, to be clear, as long as you didn't check multiple attempts, a student cannot get into a test a second time once they took it, so I'm not too worried about that. I do use the due date system for that. I make the due date the end of the first week. Remember, I don't use both the availability dates and the due dates. I pick one or the other. So at least for my diagnostic tests, I rely on the due dates. I do force completion. And in making this particular video, now I'm starting to think maybe that's a mistake, honestly. That's the only one of my suggestions here where I'm suggesting forced completion. I totally do have to deal with students that have lost connections getting in touch and doing the work to give them a second try. But I'm trying to just signal the first week that our class is very serious, that I tend to expect me to be strict. And so I think that's why I got on that track the last couple of years that I've been doing these diagnostic tests. I do set it to forced completion, so I have used that. I do set the timer to 1 hour. I do set auto submit to on. I surely think that you ought, if you're using the timer at all, you probably ought to do that. And this is honestly a test that many students complete in 20 or 30 minutes. It ought to be pretty short. The idea is it's things that really immediately ought to be automatic in their mental system for this class, so they don't tend to need the whole hour. Certainly don't use multiple attempts. I never do that. And I set that to do not show results, which is kind of uncommon. But since I am using the exact same diagnostic semester after semester, I would prefer that information not to get out there. If a student asks, I say, hey, come to my office. I will totally show you in person my office if you asked. And I get 1 or 2 people that do that each semester. So you can do that. Other thing that I have done in my math classes, like college algebra or statistics or things like that, is I do run the class with low stakes weekly quizzes. So the 3 grade components in those classes are the weekly quizzes for 15%, the in-class paper exams for a total of 50%, and a final exam for 35%. So low stakes quizzes. And what I do there is I set the availability date for a whole week. It shows up on the Monday, and it doesn't go away until the Sunday. Don't use the due date in that case. There's one specific quiz that shows up each week. It's the only thing that's visible in my testing content area. Again, trying to keep students focused on that kind of thing. I do not set forced completion. And I actually encourage students. I don't set the timer. I never use multiple attempts. I don't do that. So once they submit it once, it's in the can. And I do show the results after the availability end date. So to be clear with those things, I actually encourage students to look at the quiz, print it out if they want, go off the computer, spend a day or 2 studying, talk about it with their tutor, talk about it with other students in a study group. Oftentimes these questions are conceptual or a little bit challenging maybe. So I actually want them to generate a student group and talk about it. Come back another day, come back 2 or 3 days later once they're confident and actually submit their answers. To make, just so you know, students still don't get 100% on this all the time. So it's challenging enough, I think. And then, so because people are taking it at different times, once the availability end date occurs, which again for me, Sunday 9 p.m., then all the grades are in the can for real. And then students can get back in through their My Grades tool and see all the options and everything they submitted and what the correct answers were, and again, use that to study for the next test a little bit better. So that's what I've used. Neither one of those things are really a great model for a high-stakes in-class exam that any of us, including me, would normally do on paper with in-person proctoring. Either one of those things would only account for a 1 week, I guess 1/12 out of 15% of my final grade. So approximately about 1% of my final grade would be one of these things, not super high stakes. So brand new territory that we're stepping into, brand new for me, brand new for instructors all over the country now. And so all I can do is just kind of make some educated guesses about what we might possibly do for that. I don't know. Let me go on to the next slide. And honestly, I hesitated to even make this slide because I'm so uncertain about how this stuff is going to work for us. So here's some possibilities, question mark. Maybe if you're giving a high stakes multiple choice exam, you could use the availability feature and set the availability around your normal class time to 1 hour, or maybe 2 hours, or maybe 3 hours to allow for the technical navigational issues. Would be fine. Any one of those things would be fine, I think. I would not force completion. As Ganesh reminds us, if somebody gets disconnected, you don't want the test to just give them a 0 because they had an internet connection problem. Why not let them get reconnected in that window and finish the test? So I would recommend not forcing completion. Set the timer, which again is separate from the availability, right? If they come in at the end of the availability, they'll still have the full timer for them to work on the test. So set the timer to 1 hour or 2 hours or 3 hours. I would definitely set auto submit on so that they can't just keep working for 4 or 5 or 6 hours. And of course there'll be a flag for that, but you'll have to do more work on the back end for that. I would never set these things to multiple attempts, but I know some of our colleagues work. So again, within this weird situation, maybe give them 2 multiple attempts. That's completely legitimate, and I know that some people do that perfectly fine. And I would, again, for a multiple choice test, it's probably easiest for you to have that checked to show results after the availability is ended or after the grading is over. So that one check mark will just entirely take care of the whole process of getting the test information back to the students afterwards, and you will have to do no work whatsoever for that. So I think that's probably a pretty good idea, at least after the grading availability is ended. Other thing, I'm just kind of imagining here today, maybe you're giving a high-stakes open response test. And again, that's not going to be automatically graded. The instructor will have to get in there and grade that manually at some point. So maybe here I'm just imagining that we treat this more like a take-home exam. And I could imagine making that available for a whole calendar day. I would not force completion for the exact same reason as above, the connection issue problem. I would maybe not set the timer. Hypothetically, a student could sit there for 6 or 8 hours after the fact, but I can't imagine anybody's ever going to do that. I've never seen that in the years that I've been using Blackboard testing. I would not set multiple attempts. I would never do that myself. Could be crazy. And I would set showing results to after the attempts are graded, granted that the instructor is going to have to do some manual work to actually grade it. The grades won't be available right after the availability or the due date, so I would set that to after the attempts are graded. Or, you could lock it up totally and not show them why they got their grade, but I'm not a huge fan of that, and I'm kind of more of a fan of being as transparent as humanly possible about why students got what they wanted, why they got what they got, and using this information to increase their knowledge and get better for the next exam. So there's a couple that's kind of pretty wide range of possibilities between there. Think about what feels right for you. Think about, does this match my in-class process to my satisfaction? Think about, does this satisfy the extra problems that we're going to have in this sudden switch to online teaching, and whether we want to be maybe twice as generous as we normally would be. I think either of those things are fine. So this is all a work in progress. Again, this is the video that I was the most honestly hesitant and frankly uncomfortable about actually making. because I really don't know what the best possibilities are. I'm sure it will differ for different instructors. It'll differ for different courses. Maybe the mathematics courses will be doing something distinctly different from the computer science courses. So me included are all going to probably have some surprises coming up, and we should definitely keep iterating, finding stuff that works for us, sharing it with the other people that are teaching the same courses, sharing it with the whole department. If you find a real silver bullet for something would be great. And I'm sure in a couple months, we will all be a lot more knowledgeable about stuff that works and stuff that made more work than was useful to us. So best of luck with that. I might come back in a week or two and have a totally different opinion about this myself, and I'm sure that you will too. So keep us all informed, and I'm sure that we'll all be getting better together, and I'll look forward to being on the other side of that in a couple weeks or a couple months. So good luck, send me an email, and I'll see you soon.